All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off. So we jumped to, so the last thing that we talked about was the growth of competition and how that affected the need for us to target consumers and really figure out how to sell products to certain groups. So jumping to the 1960s, we start getting legislation that is putting regulations on packaging. So President Kennedy became aware that there was a disconnect in consumer protection as far as the packaging space was concerned. So in 1967, so up until then, there were not too many regulations on these things. In 1967, Congress enacted the FPLA, or the Fair Packaging and Label Act. So this actually directed the Federal Trade Commission and the FDA to set regulations. So they worked together and they figured out that products had to be labeled to disclose net contents, identity and the name of the business, the product's manufacturer, the packer and distributor. So this is where we start concerned. This is where we start to be concerned with things like, how much of the weight is in the product. So here we see an old Sugar Crisp box. If you're familiar with Sugar Crisp, our little bear character, he's changed a lot. We see things here like 9 ounces and net weight, however many grams. We clearly see the post, right? We see the brand, we see who made it. We see that this particular cereal is called Sugar Crisp. There's even, something to grab the kids. We have this fun little character. If a kid sees that, they're going to want it. But we also see that there's a free little game in the cereal. So we're starting to see the markings of what is people, they were holding people making these goods responsible and putting regulations on what had to be on the box. So this is where things like your nutrition label, your warning labels on alcohol, don't drink if you're pregnant, don't drink this and that. This is where these type of warnings and labels came from. So again, this authorized additional regulations as necessary to prevent. So the goal was to protect the consumer because they realized that, companies were putting out all these products that may or may not have been good for the consumer. So they wanted to prevent the consumer from being deceived and to facilitate a value comparison. So if for example, cereal companies, Post and Kellogg's, what was their brand? What was their facilitating value? What were you getting out of that product nutrition wise, and how was that helping or hurting you? So they wanted consumers to be able to make more informed and educated purchasing decisions based around health and contents of the products. So we think of, again, the idea of the package design firm. And in the mid 1960s, this was established due to the new federal regulations and the increasing importance of package design. People realized that they needed a specific company or agency to go to that specialized in package design. So the production exceeded consumer demand and competition in these agencies and firms increased. So there was a strong focus that shifted towards the tactile experience of packaging. And then in the 1970s, these firms, we went international. So everybody was working with and being concerned with packaging. So the role of package design became one of expressing a well defined marketing strategy rather than just creating a container or a point of sale billboard. So it's not just about the product and the product label, it's about the full campaign and how you get this out to the consumer. So, think of new products and how brands put out products. It's not just, oh, hey, there's a new product. Usually there's a whole campaign built around it. So if we think of Coca-Cola, think of when they first brought out the idea of where they were putting the names on the Cokes, right? That was a change in the label, a change in the packaging, but it was clearly a super targeted marketing campaign. All right, new advances in packaging. So we're finally to the 90s. In the 90s, we are seeing things like consumer product companies recognize that the need to make packaging engineers part of the product team. So the designer that was creating the graphics, as well as someone who was familiar with materials and shapes and forms to figure out what the vessel was going to be for this particular product and how that affected the product or protected the product. And then there was convenience and value. Those two factors dictated many aspects of materials development and marketing. So just taking a look at the pictures here. Thinking of cans, right? Things that could be in cans. We've got the Gillette shaving cream there, and kind of having fun with packaging. This is a Special K cereal that was produced in the 90s that was in a milk carton, right? So thinking about different vessels. It's not a box; it's a carton. It's still cardboard. We can still use this to pour. Thinking about how and why you use certain vessels and materials, and then obviously we have the Easy Squirt ketchup that was in different colors. I never ate any of that. It just looked really gross. But thinking about the squirtable ketchup, right? Like squirtable ketchup up until now in this form wasn't really super prevalent. So now we get to the 20th century to present time, and changing times and values. So through every century, you notice obviously that the focus and shift change. So throughout history, package designs have had varied objectives that reflected the needs of that particular time period. In the 20th century, we have seen consistently that a simple design has been the more central theme. And we take a look at reducing unnecessary complexity, so things that are more user friendly, concerns for sustainability and green packaging, and packaging that's more economical. Okay, so we take a look at, for example, on the right there, we see the dish soap that's easy to pour, and then we see this Heinz ketchup bottle that everybody just loves because it's much easier. You don't have to bang on the bottom of it as much. It's kind of easy squirt, bottoms up ketchup. And this one, if you'll notice the label, it says, "Guess what my bottle is made of?" And it's talking about how Heinz is using plant-based, sustainable practices by creating their packaging. So they're even advertising and promoting that to the consumer. So just to summarize and wrap things up, kind of thinking about what was happening when, obviously each of these centuries has a specific importance in what was going on during that time. But thinking about 12th to 13th century, we see the growth of the trade. It's brought about the need to transport goods. And then in the 15th to 16th century, brought about mass production of printing with the advent of the printing press. Thank you, Mr. Gutenberg. And then we have 18th century commercial expansion due to rapid growth of cities. Items were still printed by hand. And then in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, commercial lithography, invention of the papermaking machine, and development of American packaging. In the late 19th century to earliest 20th century, the companies began to offer package design services. We see the rise of the packaging design firm, so agencies specifically specializing in packaging. And then the 20th century to where we are today, focusing on simple design, sustainable practices, and how emerging technology is affecting packaging and the materials that we use. Okay, so that is the history of package design.